Welcome to The Ask. I am your host, Weiss Azimi, and in this episode, I will be taking a look at the documentary Blood on the Wall by Nick Quested and Sebastian Junger. My guest, Nick Quested, has over 35 producing credits to his name and has received 2 Emmys and an Oscar nomination for his work in documentary. His latest documentary, Blood on the Wall, seeks to answer 2 questions. What is driving people from Latin and South America to risk everything trying to cross over into the United States? And B, how the violence, corruption, and pervasiveness of organized crime in the Americas has contributed towards this crisis. This could not be a timelier documentary. Here in the United States, the incumbent president running for re-election built his original campaign around vilifying the people fleeing their home countries for a better life in America and promising to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Blood on the Wall humanizes these asylum seekers, showing how short-sighted U.S. policy in the Americas has led to this crisis, and clearly points out how the wall has done nothing to address the problems of illegal immigration and the flow of illegal drugs over the border. I am honored to have Nick Quested on the podcast today to discuss his work on this important documentary. So Nick, I would like to welcome you to The Ask. It's a pleasure to have you here. We're here to discuss your film, Blood on the Wall. It recently came out, I think, September 28th, last month, over National Geographic and multiple streaming services that give you access to this film around the globe. You've already had several conversations about your work on this film. You had an interview with Jacob Savaroff from MSNBC at your world premiere at the AFI Docs Film Festival. And just before your global release, you had a conversation along with your co-creator, Sebastian Junger, with the Washington Post. So I do want to thank, I'm sure you've spent a great deal of time discussing this film. So I do want to thank you for offering to step forward and discuss your work on this podcast with myself today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's get started right into it. Returning back to your history with this film, you finished Hell on Earth, your last major feature length. This film was completed in 2017, again for National Geographic. Shortly after you and Sebastian finishing work on Hell on Earth, why did you turn your attention to this story that you pursue in Blood on the Wall?
Well, we felt, films take about 2 years to make. So we were really thinking about what are the issues that are going to face America and the region 2 years later. And so we wanted to make a film about why people were, about Mexico and why people were leaving Mexico and Central America to come north. It started actually as an investigation into 3 countries. It was Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And so at that time, AMLO was poised to win. And it would have been an interesting tropical socialist triangle of Nicaragua, Mexico, and Venezuela. And so I went to Venezuela. I spent, several months there on and off. Was there for the elections. We did a lot of research there about how Venezuela got to where it got to. It's a fascinating place. And then, I was there for, a large part of the 100 days of protest too in Nicaragua. And the irony of the Sandinistas, the freedom fighters who triumphed over the American-supported Contras, and now the freedom fighters have become dictators is palpable. So, but in the end, it was a bit too much for National Geographic. So we decided to focus on Mexico because it is the neighbor of America, and because everyone who migrates from Central America has to go through Mexico at the same time.
Yeah, I would also add that your documentary film, Blood on the Wall, could not be more timely. We're days away from an election here in the United States, and essentially the Trump administration was built off of 2 promises. One, a Muslim ban. Secondly, building a wall to stop migrants from bringing drugs, crime, and rapists, quote unquote, over the border. So the release of this film could not be more timely. And I think what you achieve here in the way of humanizing the story of the border between the United States and its Latin and South American neighbors is a very important one. This film was announced in May of 2019 through a National Geographic press release. I'm curious as to how long was your pre-production development? And you mentioned that there was, in fact, an extensive back end that involved research in neighboring countries, not just Mexico. Roughly how long was your pre-production development, and what did that look like for this film?
It was about a year's worth of pre-production completely, including Venezuela and Nicaragua. I was starting my reading and starting, discussions with, prominent Mexican journalists and activists and politicians. But it was really hardcore for the last 6 months. So I really needed, I focused entirely on Mexico in those last 6 months.
You feature a stellar list of expert interviewees for this film. Amongst the people that you feature include personages like the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon. Please, by the way, correct my pronunciation in any of this. I don't pretend to.
No, Calderon is right.
I'm glad that I didn't mess that one up. But nevertheless, the former president of Mexico, Jack Riley, former deputy director for the Drug Enforcement Agency, and Arturo Suracan, the Mexican ambassador to the United States, to name just a few. How did you go about identifying your expert interviewees, and how did you connect with them, Nick?
Well, President Calderon is particularly important because he was the president that 14 days after he was elected by the narrowest margins in Mexican history, launched a war against all the cartels outside of the Sinaloans. So that was particularly important for us to get Calderon. And then, you contact President Calderon through his office, and then you try and find as many advocates that distinguish you from the other people that are also asking for interviews. So we talked to political operatives in the PAN, we talked to PAN lawyers, we went through a multitude of people to discuss what we want to do, and then them to advocate for us. And in regards, we had a very broad section of people we wanted to talk to, and we also obviously talked to a lot more people than emerge in the actual final film. Arturo Sarajan is an excellent and erudite speaker. That's why he made it into the film. He's so clear about the issues and how we need to think about things more in economics rather than military and political terms. There were people we didn't get. We didn't get Genaro Garcia Luna. We didn't get Cienfuegos, who's the former defense secretary and head of the army. And unfortunately, they'd have been great gets because now these two members of President Calderon's cabinet, who were the architects and implementers of his drug war, are now currently in U.S. custody.
I was going to say that there was some really incredible news, and you sort of you let the cat out of the bag. Yes, indeed, the former Mexican defense minister was arrested just, I think, this last week. And again, going back to what you just said, you very sort of astutely shared that President Calderon launched a drug war on the cartels outside of the Sinaloa territory, which perhaps is now a little bit more understandable in light of the arrest of Salvador Cienfuegos. This was a very complicated film to make, especially from just a production standpoint. One of the most challenging features to this film was the story of the Caravan. It is at the very heart of Blood on the Wall, this story of two different groups of people with this caravan trying to reach the North American border. And what I found remarkable about your team's work on this element of the story is that you really started from where it kind of began on the Guatemala-Mexico border. Could you please share with us how you were able to catch that moment in history and start your work right there, just where it was about to kick off, and how you and your team were able to navigate and document the caravan throughout its journey as it headed north through Mexico?
Well, we actually hadn't planned to shoot the caravan. We'd actually identified 6 families that we were going to meet in southern Mexico and in Honduras and Guatemala that were planning a trip north. So We were actually in Chiapas, in Actial, and we were meeting with the village, La Mesa of the village, which is basically the committee of older, mostly men, that decide the village's political future. And we were talking to them about the Actial massacre in 1998, where over 40 people were murdered by a priest and militia. But it's on the other side of a substantial mountain range. So one of the things we promised National Geographic to do is never travel at night and never travel in mountainous regions. And so we're in day 2 of our production, and we decided to leave Actial and drive to Tapachula to meet up with the caravan that was forming. So we did that straight away. And it was just a bit of luck, really. A lot of journalism is about being in the right place at the right time with the right tools. And I was complaining a lot about us having too many people to cover our 6 families, and we need to be smaller and be able to shoot for longer. And then so we turned up in Tapachula, and as the caravans approaching the bridge into Mexico, the Siachi River, and I actually had the right amount of people because I had me and a crew on one side of the river and Nico, one of my producers, on the other side of the river. So we managed to film both sides of the standoff on the bridge in southern Mexico.
That is incredible planning on part of you and your team to capture that moment in history. Returning back to that day when you and your team arrived on the Mexico-Guatemala border, we are introduced for the first time to one of the major characters in your documentary, Ludi, a young girl from Honduras who's trying to reach the North American border along with a group of her friends. In addition to Ludi, we also meet another major character for your documentary, Sarah and her family from Guatemala, who also share that same goal. How were you able to find these people in the pressure cooker that was that day of connecting with the caravan and dealing with the chaos as it tried to sort of surmount the border? How were you able to have the presence of mind to find prospective people that could really sort of serve as major characters for your documentary?
Well, we already had an idea of trying to find a diverse demographic for the people representing the migration north. So we knew we wanted some unaccompanied minors, and we knew we wanted an extended family, and we wanted, a small family at the same time, and we wanted, so we literally were very lucky. We got off our rafts. We entered Guatemala by raft because the border was closing. And we saw Ludi swimming with her crew. And so we just started talking, and then we asked them some questions, and they were like, hold on, you're not asking the same questions that journalists normally ask. And then we started chatting, and Ludi, obviously from the film, is a huge hip-hop fan, and I've made a lot of hip-hop videos, close to 150. So I mentioned some of that, and she's like, oh, I love that one. She particularly liked the Dr. Dre phone tap video. So we had a connection at that point, and it just sort of went from there. And we didn't leave. We kept on going. We were there from Guatemala all the way up to Tijuana, and as one of our other family style on show crossed into America, we followed them the whole way. So that's how we sort of did it. We didn't. We just sort of stayed. We walked with the caravan. We drove with the caravan. We climbed on trucks with the caravan. I was on a truck with Ludi for a while. The caravan were very gracious in accepting us and protecting us. We were part of the caravan to a large extent. There was one moment I remember when I was on the bridge, and I'm sort of walking backwards to get a shot, and I'm looking in the monitor on the camera, but I'm walking backwards, and a guy comes out and basically sort of tackles me. And I'm like, what's going on? But he hasn't tackled me. He stopped me falling into like a 4-foot hole that I hadn't seen. So it wasn't just they protected us from organized crime and cartels. He protected us from ourselves, like having stupid accidents.
That's incredible. I was curious about that, about how you were able to keep up with both the caravan, Ludi, and Sarah's family.
We swapped in and out. So there's me, there was Nico Lupo, one of my producers, and Peter Growitz. We would just alternate because there was always someone on the caravan. Like we'd go for 2 weeks, someone else would come for 2 weeks, somebody else would come for 2 weeks. And we'd overlap so that we could continue, we could debrief each other and tell you what's actually going on and what the issues are with these people at this point. And then I was like, while the Caravan was in Mexico City, I would go and do some interviews while Nico was covering the Caravan, all sorts of things like that.
I think I
have to say, it's a lot down to National Geographic trusting us. I mean, when you look at television nowadays, there's very few examples of films or programming where people don't know what they're going to get. You look at most television, it's already pre-scripted. They know exactly what's going to go on and they shoot to a format. Well, we didn't know. With documentaries, you don't know what's going on, and they have to trust our skill and our tenacity to keep going until we've told the story that we think needs to be told. And that's very rare to be commissioned like that, especially nowadays. It's a very select group of people who are allowed to do that. And we have to thank National Geographic for trusting us. Big shout out to Courtney Monroe and to Matt Renner and to Chris Albert. Those guys are awesome.
I would also add that I think one of the benefits of having embedded with the Caravan throughout the duration of their journey and just not parachuting in for a handful of interviews, as perhaps a traditional production would have done, is that you, as the viewer, you really get to see the transformation of Ludi as a young woman. Through the hardship of this experience, she begins as a bubbly, bright teenager with this just tremendous sort of aura of hope around her and her friends. But you and your team do a remarkable job of showing over time the toll that this journey takes on her, and in many ways, sadly, changes her forever. And I encourage viewers to watch this documentary to see that journey and that transformation take place. So that's impressive. So essentially the way you did it is you rotated out 3 sort of production units throughout the duration of the Caravan's journey up north.
Yes.
You mentioned yourself, Peter Growitz, and Nick Lupo as sort of trading places as the production went along. What sort of resources did you have? Like, were you working with 3 camera operators? What did your setup look like for the unit?
Well, when I would work, I work with one other cameraman. I direct the scene and I cover the cutaways because I'm always looking to shorten the scenes with my cutaways. So that's generally how we work, is that you have the cameraman basically being you're the foundation that you build on, and then we can add shots in on top of that.
Understood.
So like, for example, when we saw Ludi getting off the swimming and we had the conversation with her, Rodrigo shot the 2-shot of Ludi and Jorge talking, and then I would shoot the rest of her crew nodding or agreeing or whatever it was that they were doing, so I could actually use that as a cutaway to shorten the scene. Or I would go and shoot some rafts, or I would shoot a much bigger wide shot of something so that I can establish the scene and shorten it.
I see. So most of your units would have 2 camera operators?
Yeah, one professional DP and then the other being the producer or director of that sequence. Like
Gotcha.
Peter shot a lot and Nico shot a little bit. Nico's not as experienced as Peter or I, so he was working it out.
Now, since we're on the subject of Sarah and Ludi, your 2 principal characters for the Caravan, at a later point in the film, we begin to see Ludi creating these sort of video confessionals about her journey as she gets closer to the North American border. How did that come about? Was that something that she started to do on her own?
No, we gave cameras to everyone. That's part of our style, is to get the subjects to film themselves, because they can express things that they want to show you, and they can get closer. No matter how long we spent with the Caravan, no matter how I'm still a 6'2" gringo, right? I stand out. Me and Rodrigo, who's Mexican, would be on the bridge. Rodrigo's 6'3". I could look down a sea of black heads and see him 100 yards away. I could never lose him in that crowd. So when you hand your subjects a camera, you're getting much closer to the reality of their situation, because cell phones and smartphones particularly are ubiquitous nowadays. They're everywhere. And so behavior doesn't change when people start recording on that smartphone. So, a smartphone that shoots in 4K with a decent picture costs $150 nowadays. So, that's what we did. We find it's much closer to the documentary reality that we're trying to convey than it is anything that we could actually do.
Yeah, and to your credit, some of the rawest moments, as far as Ludi's journey is concerned, are self-documented. when she's sort of not trying to sort of perform for the camera and just sort of, broadcasting her real thoughts. It was an effective way of bringing forward her story in a very authentic manner. And actually that is, I don't want to move away from Blood on the Wall too much, but how did your work on Hell on Earth prepare you for a film like this? Because from what I've read and what I've heard about your work on Hell on Earth, there were certain strategies that you reapplied to your work on Blood on the Wall.
Well, we like to use, so this is how I put it to some people that are trying to explain it. We don't cover news events. We cover our characters' experience at news events. So what we try and use is our characters to explain being the micro that explains the macro. So in Hell on Earth, we used our family that was living in ISIS-controlled territory, which we managed to get them a camera phone. They documented their life under ISIS. They documented their escape from ISIS territory, and then their escape into Turkey over the Syrian border, and then their attempt to get to Europe on a rubber raft. And then once they were in Turkey, I picked them up and I started framing them I filmed their negotiations with the smugglers, and I filmed them on the way to the boats and things like that. So we have this a very important thing is that the micro explains the macro and the macro puts context to the micro. And that's the same technique that we were using here, is that we had Caravan, we had characters on the Caravan, but we also had, because you can't separate the politics of migration from the politics of narcotics and the politics of corruption of the Mexican government. So I also spent 2 to 3 months with the Cartel de Sinaloa in the mountains of Sinaloa in La Sierra Madre Occidental, and then on the border, because the routes of the migrants and the routes of the narcotics is the same. So we followed the narcotics and we followed the people all the way to America. And as you can see from the film, we followed them all the way to America, all the way to a hotel room in downtown Los Angeles, with the whole world and city revolving around you. We're in a room with 8 kilos of heroin that we'd followed from Mexicali.
It's an incredible journey. And actually, thank you for bringing up that element of the documentary, because alongside the Caravan, much of your film is dedicated to unpacking the rise of the drug cartels in Mexico and what that has done to the country and to the people. And that actually ties directly into my next question. Mexican drug cartels thrive on staying in the shadows and surrounding their work with secrecy. What incentives or motives did cartel members like Rafa, one of the gunmen that you feature in your film, have to go on camera for a documentary like this?
What were the prerequisites? Sorry.
No, what were their incentives and motives to actually let you in and sort of...
Well, I don't know if there's much incentive apart from this, and we discussed this, with them extensively, is that the Cartel de Sinaloa and the men of the mountains of the Sierra Madre live in a brutal, and in the same way deprived of, the same type of luxuries that people in the cities have. It's a very basic lifestyle, and they have a very basic code that they live by. And it feels very much like the Old West. So they very much wanted to show us how this code worked for them and what it meant to them. And, so we also, while we're there, we're chatting, a narco has no existential crisis. He runs as fast for as long as he can to make as much money as he can. He's like, it feels like almost Blade Runner-esque in the sense that the light that burns brightest burns shortest. And so they wanted to show us that, they're not the monsters that the president wants everyone to believe. And to a certain extent, they wouldn't even exist without the US legislation. If it wasn't for the appetite of America for narcotics and the prohibition of narcotics, they wouldn't have people like El Chapo or El Mencho or El Mayo. And what's the difference between El Mayo and El Chapo and Al Capone or the Kennedys? It just depends where you are in history. And then look at Mexico and say, well, Mexico has enormous problems of corruption, but so did America. I mean, Fierro LaGuardia ran on an anti-corruption message platform and his opposition was, the Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was a massive example of systematic civic corruption in New York for many years. So is Mexico any different from America? 100 years ago.
That is an excellent point that you make, and the fact that there is an inextricable tie between the United States and Mexico in regards to the phenomena of the drug cartels. And you make this point, well, you don't make this point, but your interviewees make this point throughout your documentary. There are some very poignant scenes with some drug manufacturers who quite candidly share on camera that these drugs are in fact worthless here in Mexico. But once they move past the Mexico-American border, suddenly their value skyrockets. And that's because, as you said, of the great demand for narcotics. You point out the fact that there is criminality and corruption in the United States, which provides a space for these cartels to do business throughout the country. Returning back to Rafa and the other underworld figures that you interviewed for your film, how did you go about connecting with them? And what was it like building that kind of trust that allowed them to invite you to the Golden Triangle at the heart of Sinaloa territory?
We had a funny way of meeting Rafa and his boss. We actually met them through a narco corrido, and who was their elementary school teacher. We were actually thinking of featuring this narco corrido in the film, because corridos are like gangster mariachis. If you want to think of it like that, there might be an easier way to conceptualize them. And then we were always working on this angle of how do we get to go to the mountains. And it was through my local producer, Miguel Angel Vega, that we met this narco corrido, and he introduced us to the boss and to Rafa. And, we went for dinner a couple of times first, and then they trusted us. I mean, I think it's a mutual thing. They watched some of our films as well. They told me they watched the Syria film. So, they felt that we were going to be fair, and that's what they wanted. That's how we move forward.
I think that's really important context for your access to the cartels. It made a very important difference in regards to your own safety. One of the more scary moments in the film for myself, imagining, me being in the car as a filmmaker, was when you embedded with a cartel enforcer or hitman. And he was driving around and explaining on camera essentially what he does for the cartel and the way of enforcing the rules and what happens when someone steps beyond those rules and what's required of him. Were there times when you and your crew felt unsafe, or how did you go about ensuring the safety of you and your team?
The only time we really felt unsafe was actually in America. We were in a hotel room with two members of the cartel in Phoenix. It was a shitty motel in area Phoenix called Maryvale. And we were waiting for them to film them going south with, the proceeds of their drug business. So the car was meant to meet us at this hotel, and it gets pulled over by the police. And as it gets pulled over by the police, the room gets lit up with like the light from a police helicopter and, the flashing lights of the police cars. And the guys who, we've been in this room now for 3 or 4 hours. They'd done a little blow, they smoked a little weed, they'd done some more blow, they smoked some more weed, they did some more blow, they smoked some more weed. So they were pretty toasted right at this point. And they look at me and they go, "You're the police." And I'm like, "No, I'm not the police." No, of all the people in the world, I'm not the police. And they were like, "Well, tell me you're not the police then, because, federal police officers can't lie." And I was like, "Well, I'm going to tell you I'm not the police, but I'm also going to say that federal police officers lie all the time, and it's only in the movies that happened." And they were like, "Oh, well, that's a good point. Yeah, the feds lie all the time. What are you talking about? Of course they..." So that actually sort of broke the ice back the other way. So it broke the tension in the room, and they were like, "All right, fine. But for a moment there, we were like, this isn't so great. There's police outside, there's guns on the table, and they've done a lot of blow. So the paranoia must have been high for them. So that was a moment that made my heart race for a second.
Yeah, no, I think it would make anyone's heart race.
But, sometimes when your heart races, time slows down a little bit. So, you get to think in very erudite ways in certain circumstances. So, lucky we made the right choices.
Thank goodness you and your team emerged safe and sound. And going back to the difficulty and danger of this film, you mentioned this incident in this motel in Phoenix when the gang members you were with became suspicious of you and your background. I understand that was a potentially dangerous moment for you, but I'm curious as to what was the single most difficult scene for you to witness as the filmmaker making this film. When I was watching Blood on the Wall for myself, I think the most heartbreaking scene for me is towards the end of your film when Ludi, her world coming apart, her friends surrendering themselves to be deported back to Honduras, being abandoned by her boyfriend, she turns and finds solace in crystal meth. And there's an incredibly sad scene where she's invited by her friends to try this drug, smoking it through a light bulb. And for me, that was a difficult scene to watch. I was thinking to myself, if I was part of the crew, would I have told Ludi not to do it? Would I have interceded? Would I have allowed it to play out? Because this is the truth of these people that we needed to bring awareness to. So I'm curious, Nick, for you as a filmmaker, what was the single most difficult scene for you to witness while making this film?
We didn't shoot that scene. Ludi shot that scene and gave us the footage, so we weren't there for that scene. I think the hardest scenes to potentially shoot were the scenes in Acapulco, because Acapulco is a asymmetrical war at the moment with 8 or 9 different factions fighting on a street-by-street basis for control. And control means that you can sell drugs and extort people. And so we turned up to one scene, and the local journalists we were working, Carlos and Ruben, are so good that they get there before the police got there. So when we got there, I ran forward and started saying, okay, let's do this, we'll shoot this. And they were like, no, wait a second. I was like, well, what do you want to wait? Let's do it right now. It's still
It's happening. Yeah.
It's happening. And they were like, no, wait. And I was like, what do you mean, wait? It's like, well, let's wait for the police, because the chances are the guy's still here. And we don't want to film him right now. So that was not like an emotionally difficult scene, but it was like a technically difficult scene to shoot. And then you've got the emotion of the scene at the time with the daughter of the fishmonger who's just been killed. And he's been killed over $5. Let's just be real about that as well. Just crying. So that was a heart-wrenching scene.
So that's something to bring up as well. You did a fantastic job through the story of Acapulco of showing the consequences of the unwinding of Mexico as these various cartels and various drug gangs battle for territory. And I was thinking to myself that you filmed a lot of homicides for that part of the film. That must have been a difficult thing to subject yourself to as a person. No right-minded person looks forward to seeing violence like that. You've moved on to other projects. Blood on the Wall was completed several months ago, and it's just being released now. It's been in the rearview mirror for you as a filmmaker for some time. I'm curious, if you could go back to Blood on the Wall, to the making of it, if there's anything you would have wanted to have changed or to have done differently.
Well, I would like Genaro Garcia Luna and General Cienfuego. I'd like to have got a couple more interviews with maybe Admiral Ortega, who ran the Marines and the interdiction squad that caught El Chapo twice. But no, I think we set out to we're very happy with the film we've made. So, you can never cover everything. So are we happy with the film we made? Yes, absolutely. We think it's a representative portrait of the political and social history of Mexico. And we think we have representative characters that humanize, people who've traditionally been vilified.
Fair. This particular interview with you is really about process. I think that you've done a great job covering some of the big picture storytelling with some of your previous interviews. I'm hoping that when people listen to this, they get a real feel for the process of making this film. So I'd like to dive into some of the key creatives and key people within the team that you worked with to make this happen, starting, of course, with your creative partner, Sebastian Junger. You've been working as a producer and filmmaker for many years, and you've worked with a broad range of directors over the course of your career as a producer, but you have a very important collaboration with Sebastian Junger. And over the past decade, both of you have made some important documentaries about conflicts around the world and stories about people that are hard to reach, like the story of this unit at Restrepo in the heart of Afghanistan, and on to Hell on Earth, and most recently, Blood on the Wall. What was that collaboration like between you and Sebastian for this film? And how has that evolved since your time working on Hell on Earth?
Sebastian was writing a book, so Sebastian spent more time in the edit room, and I would discuss storylines with him, and then we would deliver them to the edit room, and then he would work on them. So that's evolved from Restrepo, where he was the foreign correspondent on the ground and filming. So everything evolves. I mean, we're working on something where I think he's going to be much more involved with being on the ground right now, which we can't quite talk about yet, but it just sort of varies. I mean, like team sports, you've got to think of it like a team sport making documentaries. So you need everyone to fill roles, but not everyone can be the center forward and not everyone can be the defender. You've got to play your role. So we sort of flow like water and fill the holes in where they need to be filled in.
I look forward to hearing more about your upcoming collaboration with Sebastian, but thank you for sharing how you guys went about approaching your work on Blood on the Wall. Your colleague, Peter Growitz, is listed as one of the producers for this film. How did you connect with him, and how did he contribute to this production?
I connected with Peter through Katie Gilbert, who is our security coordinator. She's like Mama Bear. She makes sure that she knows where I am at all times. And if something bad goes wrong, she's sending the right people to make it right. So she was a friend of Peter's, and Peter's experience was he speaks Spanish reasonably well, and he's had experience doing a lot of like survival television, and so he's used to being in uncomfortable environments, and he doesn't complain, and that's really important to me because like people who complain are not going to last long.
It's important, especially for a film like this, that you have the kind of crew that can endure the hardship of the production, because as you mentioned earlier, it was not an easy film to make, nor was it a comfortable film to make, I think, in many ways. Gretchen McGowan and Nico Lupo Sonnabend are listed as co-producers for this film. I understand that Gretchen has served as your head of production for many years at Goldcrest, but could you please tell us how both she and Nico contributed to the success of this film?
Well, Gretchen is our head of production at Goldcrest, so Gretchen is involved in all the films we make. So Gretchen makes sure that we're staying on budget, make sure that we have the right equipment. You know, Gretchen is the oil in the machine. She's the biggest cog and the oil in the machine too. And then Nico was a trained journalist. So I'm not a trained journalist. I'm a filmmaker, and I learned journalism from Sebastian. So Nico is a good sort of counterpoint to some of my crazy ideas. He's like, I don't know if that's ethical. So it was a good balance in the end. That's basically sort of how it works.
One of the most distinctive features for me experiencing Blood on the Wall was your standout score. It's both haunting and somber, and I think really complemented the visual storytelling of your film. How did you arrive?
Thank you. That was Andres. I got Andres through my friend Eduardo Gu. Eduardo made a great film called Days of Grace, and I've known him for a while from New York. He also made Mars for National Geographic, and I was like, listen, I need a Mexican composer because the film evolves musically and graphically from the south to the north, and you can see the way the film is colored. It's much warmer in the south, it's much colder in the north. And then the narco themes and the political themes, each are great in a different way. The narcos have this slight green tinge to it, and the political and social history element is a much starker, contrasty, sparse look. And so we wanted to do the same thing with the music. So the music evolves from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. So the type of instrumentation was important. Like, so you use southern Mexican instruments at the beginning, and then towards the end we use these. It's much more a norteño style score at that point. So it's very subtle, but I needed someone from Mexico to understand that. So you have to also understand that apart from me and Peter, whose Spanish isn't our first language, so we speak Spanish, everyone was from Mexico, or Nico's is a Catalan, but everyone else on the crew was from the region. And there's a lot of discussions about who should be telling what stories for who. And so it was very important for me to find local journalists and local cameramen and a local composer and empower them to help me tell their stories to a certain extent. That's why we give people their own phones, because they can tell their own stories. They're choosing what they shoot and give to you. And in the same way, when you're working with a local cameraman, they know much better the political history of their country. And it's also an education for me. Like, there's nothing better than a 13-hour car ride with someone who knows the subject way better than you, because you're going to have this conversation and you're going to become richer for it.
Yeah, I think
I love car rides.
And there is some beautiful driving around the Mexican North American border. That's true. But going back to your score, thank you for sharing your process on it. And I think that because of the thought that was put into it, I can definitely see that sort of auditory transformation as the viewer progresses through the film. One of the big beats for me at the beginning of your film is the unveil of the Caravan for the first time. And Andres' soaring score captures the hope and optimism of these people, I think, beautifully, to flee the violence and poverty they're hoping to escape from. You pack a lot of history and information in the running time of this film. You know, there are documentaries that you will usually, or news pieces that will capture one facet of one of the pillars that make up this documentary, whether it's the Caravan issue, whether it's the cartel issue, whether it's the history of the United States and Latin Americas. But you really wanted to provide a sort of full overview for the viewer with this film. And I can imagine trying to thread all of this must have been a real mission for you in the edit. What role did your editor, Paula Heredia, play in helping you put this puzzle together?
We had a story map in our heads, and basically Paolo is excellent at helping us turn that story map into the reality of filmmaking. So she becomes, an editor needs to be objective as possible, and that's really what we needed as a basis, and Paolo is excellent at providing. And then she provides the flourishes of juxtaposition of imagery that adds to meaning. So it was just a excellent collaboration. She was already so well versed in the subject as well. It was like, another learning process for me.
I know that Paula is based in New York and has been for some time as a filmmaker herself. How did you connect with her for this edit?
She worked at the Goldcrest several times. She made in a film A Live Day Memories, where we first met.
Matt Renner and Fisher Stevens are listed as executive producers for this film. I understand that Matt Renner serves as vice president of production at National Geographic worldwide, and Fisher Stevens is a decorated filmmaker in his own right.
Did you say decorated or decorative?
Either or. Did I say decorative? How did each of them contribute to your film in their roles as EPs?
Well, Matt's the voice of National Geographic, so he was there to support us, and Matt's an excellent additive executive. He pushes you to go further, and he's there to find this the perfect balance, but it's excellent executive to have around you. Fisher is provocative and it's just trying to push you to get you to the best place you can through a variety of ways. Like, I remember I was very disappointed the first time I showed the cut to Fisher, and he goes, meh. I'm like, I don't know. I thought you had better stuff than this. and I was like, oh. And he's, you know what? He was right. We had better stuff. And we went back and we tweaked it. And then he came back and he goes, oh, that's what I'm talking about. So, you get very set in your ways as a filmmaker, and you get accustomed to watching things down and don't think about how these are playing out. Sometimes you have to separate yourself because you feel like you're making a film for yourself because that's part of the driver. But in the end, you need to step back and say, well, I'm not doing that. I'm making a film for other people. I'm trying to communicate this subject. So it doesn't matter how long it took to make that shot or how difficult it was to get that interview. If it doesn't contribute to the narrative and to the story or to the film, there's no point it being in there. And that's, where your editor and where people like Fisher really come in and help. Fisher's been involved with so many great films that, he can cut quickly to isolate things that he feels are problematic.
Matt Renner was involved by default. National Geographic is the commissioning partner for Blood on the Wall. How did you rope in Fisher into this team?
Oh, I've known Fisher for a while, so I just called him.
Easy answer. Lastly, I know he doesn't show up on the credits, but I know he has a desk across from you in your office and works closely with you on all your projects. How did your colleague David Kennedy help you bring this film to fruition?
Well, we're always chatting, so we just chat about what we think's the most important thing to go and chase, and then we sort of work out how we're going to do it. David's sitting he's at his desk right now, and he's poring over some intense legalese. There's lots of cogs that make this work, and it's a team sport, as I said. Everyone fills in for everyone else in this world.
Blood on the Wall is a tremendous effort. It's another film that you can proudly include in the library of investigative documentary that you produced over the years. I do have one question for you as a filmmaker, this is sort of filmmaker to filmmaker, you are dealing with really difficult subject matter. You are spending time with desperate people, whether it's the cartel members trying to, as you said, get rich quick and hopefully get out so they can change their lives, or whether it's Sarah and her family trying to flee poverty and violence in Guatemala, or whether it's Ludi looking for a better life for herself than the one that she can have in Honduras. Each and every one of the people that you spend time with in this documentary come from a place of desperation. And, you finished the film, but it's not a movie. These aren't actors. These are real people. How do you, I'm not going to go into how you stay in touch or not stay in touch with the people that you bring forward in your documentary. I don't think that would be an appropriate question to ask, given the sensitivity of maybe your answer here. But how do you as a person cope with that off the back of the film? I'm curious because, again, these people stay with you. How do you move on?
I don't know. We stay in touch with Ludi. We were just in contact with her. She's back in Honduras now. She's with her baby. She's living at a friend's house. She has a room. I'm still in touch with the family of Rawan and Marwan. They're in Germany now. And Adnan, their brother, is in Edinburgh University in their museum there teaching archaeology. I went back to see Rafa because I was in Culiacan for something else recently, but the pandemic is that's upended everything. So now it's only virtual at the very least, but we're always in touch with lots of people. There's lots of social networks to stay in touch now, especially WhatsApp. WhatsApp is really the way we keep communicating. We'll be friends forever. So you might not have chatted this month, but we'll always be in contact.
That's a great answer. So essentially, you do not move on, and the people that invite you into their lives stay with you for the rest of yours as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I would say so.
Finally, as our last sort of capstone question for you, thank you again for your time, Nick. I appreciate it. What is the most important takeaway you want audiences to have when they watch your film, Blood on the Wall?
I think the most important takeaway is that the approach to the issues of migration and narcotics are looked at through a military perspective rather than through an economic perspective. And if you want to deal with these issues, you have to reduce the push factors and you have to reduce the pull factors. So instead of legalizing narcotics isn't a solution, but you can see that the society hasn't changed massively by the state legalization of cannabis, but it has massively reduced the incentive for Mexicans to grow and smuggle cannabis to America. There's changed. Now there's businesses actually growing. The cartel will never leave the business, but the cartel now is having illegal operations in the United States. I think that's a better solution than this mass exportation of narcotics from the South. So maybe you look at the state-based legalization of certain narcotics and see how that affects the incentives for the exportation of narcotics. At the moment, every effort is done to prevent narcotics coming to America, only increases the incentive for smugglers to smuggle them because it's more expensive. So as it gets more expensive, the incentive is increasing. And then I'd like people to look at the incentives for people migrating. So until we deal with corruption in these countries at a systematic and presidential level, whether it's Hernandez in Honduras or Morales in Guatemala or Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and you deal with the systematic corruption at every level, if we continue to finance these presidential kleptocratic regimes, we're not going to see any effect on the ground, and you can continue to see people migrating because they have no hope. No money trickles down. There's no projects for the youth. You have countries that are dependent on single corporations, basically in the sense of Honduras. There's very little tourism. You need to provide a reason for them to stay at the moment. So I think people need to think about this in economical terms, that in economics as the basis of their thought process, rather than this military and policing attitude that currently exists.
That's very poignantly expressed, Nick, and I agree with you. As long as our government doesn't take steps to help take its southern neighbors in a better direction and redress things that it did in the past to help set up the conditions for the current crisis in Latin and South America, you will always have blood on the wall. And I would like to add here, and I think that you do a great job of addressing this. I believe it's an entire documentary in and of itself, but there's a very important moment in your film where you take on the U.S. banking system and how it has played its own role in facilitating the drug business by allowing cartels to launder money through the U.S. financial system. And you specifically call out HSBC in Wachovia for having
Yes, absolutely.
helped the cartels launder billions upon billions worth of dollars for themselves. And that Mexican journalist that you interview, I forget her name right now, but she puts it very poignantly that as long as the financial system is not taken on to sort of siphon off the spigot for the cartels, you will always have this problem in Mexico.
Yes, indeed.
Well, Nick, thank you again for guesting on the Ask. It was a pleasure talking to you today. I do want to encourage everyone who's listened to this podcast to seek out Blood on the Wall for yourself. Just go to nationalgeographic.com. You can find information about where to watch Blood on the Wall through your TV provider.
It'll be on iTunes in 2 weeks. It's going to be on Hulu too, and it's currently on National Geographic.
There you go.
Thank you so much for having me, Wazy.
It was a pleasure. Take care, Nick.
Okay, take care. Cheers. Bye.